Hey everyone, this is Nitro. In this video, I want to talk all about how to build Dieharte, or Dietharte, the wandering knight who loves his freedom. So, let's begin by first mentioning that Dieharte does not become a top level character until his unique helm is released. Before that, he's a good character, but at the same time, nothing really stands out about him. He's fairly generic, if you will. But once that helm becomes released, Dieharte is like a seriously powerful contender in PvP mode. So he's probably not the absolute top tier in PvP, but he's certainly near the top. So, what is this unique helm? Well, it's called Golden Lion, and when eliminating an enemy on this turn, it will apply stun state to one enemy within 3 blocks after taking action. And this effect of stun lasts 1 turn. So it's like if you kill one of the enemies, another enemy can get stunned, and that leaves, only 3 enemies available for movement for the enemy team. Unless they dispel that stun, of course. But then if you have lots of debuffs stacked on, for example, let's say you have Bozo toss an Earthquake or something, then it becomes very, very luck-based whether that stun is removed or not. So Dieharte can practically win you a match single-handedly if he kills off one target and then applies stun on another target and it's the right one. Okay, so with that said, let's talk about Dieharte's talent. And his talent is called Free Will. The first part of it is that it increases crit hit rate by a certain percentage. It starts off at 10% at 3 stars, goes up to 13% at 4 stars, 16% at 5 stars, and it caps out at 20% crit hit increase at 6 stars. There's a second effect of his talent, where after eliminating enemy, it will trigger smoke, and the smoke's effect is all damage taken is decreased by 30%. This lasts 1 turn. There's a 3-turn cooldown at 3 stars. At 4 and 5 stars, it drops to a 2-turn cooldown, and at 6 stars, it becomes a 1-turn cooldown. So it's actually a very, very useful talent. In many ways, though, this talent, it doesn't have that much of an impact when he's in his Cavalry class. However, if Dieharte is in his High Master class, this talent is absolutely amazing. And that is why Dieharte really should be in his High Master class rather than Royal Knight in his final state. Now, with all that said, his High Master class is very, very equipment dependent. So I'll go over his equipment once I get to that portion of this video. But before I begin talking about his, his final classes and how to build them as both High Master and Royal Knight, let me first talk about his soldier bonds. Okay, and his soldier bonds are kind of interesting. They're kind of unique. By default, it boosts hit points by 10%, attack by 10%, defense by 10%, and then there's no boost to magic defense. Okay, so 10, 10, 10, 0. It's a kind of odd boost because it's kind of separated, right? Now, in addition to that, his bonds. Let's bring that up quickly. His bonds, his first bond, of course, is, as always, all stats increase by 10%. But his third bond is an attack and defense increase for his soldiers. So what that means is, at max level, his soldier bonds are actually 20% hit points, 35% attack, 35% defense, and 10% magic defense. So it's very offensive oriented. It's not quite the full plus 40% attack value that a lot of other characters have, but at plus 35% it is close enough. And the thing to be aware of is because he increases hit points by 20% and defense by 35%, he can tank melee and physical attacks very well. So archers and melee attacks, he can tank quite well. However, he does not deal very well with magic attacks at all, right? 20% hit points and 10% magic defense does not provide much help against magic defense, or against magic attacks. So that's something to be aware of. In a lot of ways, he's very similar to Elwyn in that sense, right? Great against melee attacks and physical attacks like archer attacks, and horrible against magic attacks. Alright, so with all this said, oh, let me just mention one other thing about his bonds. His 4th bond is unlocked by Kirikaze, which is quite easy to unlock, but his 5th bond requires Tiaris to unlock. So in order to actually truly use Dieharte, you really need Tiaris, because remember, this last bond is worth basically plus 15% attack value. If you don't have this bond, your Dieharte probably won't have the ability to one-shot enemies. And if you can't one-shot enemies, his talent won't really trigger. So, just so you're aware of. In order to use Dieharte, you really need Tiaris. Okay, so with all that said, now let's talk about his classes and the skills that he unlocks. Okay. From Knight, he gets Move Again. You know, Move Again is a great skill. When attacking, damage is increased by 10%. And if there's remaining mobility is not 0, you can move again after attacking. Just a very, very useful skill, you know. From his swordsman class, his side branch, he gets the skill Detect. And it's a passive where crit hit rate is increased by 10%. When dealing damage, you have a 50% chance to disable enemy passive skills, and this lasts 2 turns. And there's a 100% chance to trigger when landing a critical hit. In my opinion, this skill is basically useless for Dieharte, because Dieharte should be the character that kills off your enemies due to smoke and so on. So using this skill, which only really activates if the enemy survives, is terrible. In addition, the swordsman class only gives 80 hit points and plus 5 skill, so it's not the greatest class to use a runestone in. So you can kind of safely ignore this swordsman class. Alright, next let's talk about his 2 cavalry lines. So from Highlander, he gets Strike, and this is one of really Dieharte's core skills, because it's basically a weaker version of Chivalry. Okay, what it does is when you activate it, your attack is increased by 20%, which lasts 1 turn. And when cast, you can move another 3 blocks in attack. That's the big thing, that you can move another 3 blocks in attack. That additional 3 mobility is critically important for PvP. So that's why this is one of his core skills. Let's move on to the next class. Royal Knight gives him Violent Dash, where for every 1 block moved before battle, unit crit increases by 5%. Crit damage increases by 5%. So, and both of these are up to 15%. So it's just extra damage if a crit occurs, which is quite powerful. And there's also Thousand Hooves, of course. Thousand Hooves is a skill that doesn't need to be introduced. Leon has it. It's one of the great PvP skills. Not as great for PvE because of the 5-turn cooldown, but dominant in PvP. Oh, just another thing I should mention about Violent Dash. It does cost 2 points. And that, in many ways, is what prevents you from using this skill very often, because it's just really expensive. 2 points is very hard to give for a passive. Alright, let's talk about his Raider and High Master class. From Raider, he gets the 1-point skill Sneak Attack, where when dealing critical hit in battle, deal extra fixed damage once after battle. And the damage is equal to 2 times the hero's attack value. This can allow you to kill off an opponent that manages to survive. So it can be a very, very useful skill to have on Dieharte. And finally, there is his High Master skill. From High Master, he gets first, Light of Hope, a faction buff, and second, Calamity. Calamity is a skill that, as with all assassins, it ignores guard and attacks the enemy directly. This skill deals 1.3 times damage, and before battle, you can drain a maximum of 2 buffs from the enemy. So you can basically steal 2 buffs from the enemy, take them for yourself, and then hit them pretty hard. Basically, you know, if you're using Dieharte in his assassin class, it's pretty much a must bring along skill. And the other skill is the faction buff called Light of Hope. It's a faction buff with an additional effect where when unit has 5 or more buffs, all stats increase by 15%. So 15% more attack, 15% more defense, magic defense, and this faction buff lasts 4 turns. This is a very, very powerful faction buff because faction buff itself provides 4 buffs. So all you need is 1 additional buff for this to kick in. And the additional buff can be very easy to get. For example, Tiaris. Her talent will apply a healing buff, and that's your 5th buff. If you have Sophia, if she heals, her talent gives another 5th buff as well. So there's quite a few ways to get that 5th buff. And similarly, if Dieharte uses Calamity and he manages to steal 1 buff successfully, that's not guaranteed because, if he steals the enemy's faction buff, it's just replacing his existing faction buff. But yeah, so there's lots of ways to add that 5th buff for another 15% attack and other stats, which is great for PvE. In terms of PvP, I honestly can't say that your assassins or your melee characters, your damage dealers in general, should be carrying the faction buff. So, just something to be aware of. Alright, so we've talked about all his skills. So now let's talk about building Dieharte. Dieharte is actually, when you use him, he's surprisingly useful in Guild Wars because of the factions that he's a part of. He's part of Protagonist, he's part of Origin of Light, and he's part of Meteor. So these 3 factions, the fact that he's part of these 3 very distinct factions means you'll almost always have a use for him in Guild Wars every single week. Now, with that said, he's even in his Cavalry class without any double class mastery, he's actually very, very good in this because as in the Protagonist class, there's basically no Cavalry, right? Dieharte is really your only Cavalry unless you have Landius. So there's 2 Cavalry right now, but most people don't have Landius. So having Dieharte as a Cavalry class is great for the Protagonist fights. Origin of Light is kind of in a similar situation. Dieharte is 1 Cavalry, and Geralt and Layla, I think most people have made Geralt and Layla into her healer class, her mage/healer class. So again, Dieharte is the only Cavalry here. Meteor. Granted, Meteor is where there's a lot of Cavalry, right? There's Lard. Actually, there's only Lard, isn't there? So Lard's the only other Cavalry than Dietharte. So again, there's a fairly limited number of Cavalry units in all 3 of these factions. So Dieharte as a Cavalry in those is great. And you can see I used him a lot in my Guild Wars fights, and I only have him at 2 out of 4 class mastery, but he's been performing solidly. I won't say wonderfully because he does struggle to kill off targets, but it's been a solid performance. We're at 2 out of 4 class mastery. Alright, so let's talk about how you would build Dieharte as a Royal Knight then, because this is what you would use him for most likely in Guild Wars. So, as a Royal Knight, he has access to... There's 3 soldiers he can use. Heaven's Guard, Dragoon, and the Griffin Knight. My personal suggestion is actually the Griffin Knight, because it's the best balance of attack and defense, whereas Heaven's Guard are more of a glass cannon, and Dragoon, you're highly unlikely to have leveled up properly. So of the 3 options, I would highly recommend Griffin Knight as opposed to Heaven's Guard or Dragoon, at least especially at this current stage of the game. The other reason for this recommendation is because, if I open up the Flyer branch, it's because of the unique, I guess, soldier skills. Okay, the Flyer branch has first the Preemptive Strike, where when Flyer and aquatic hit points is above 80%, attack and defense is increased by 20%, right? This then stacks with the Griffin Knight's personal attack and defense increase when their hit point is 80%. So that's a huge bonus right there in terms of attack and defense values. And then the other ones he gets is this one here, Amphibious Raid, where when attacking units with 100% hit points, Flyer and aquatic attack and defense is increased by a 20%. So that's yet another 20% attack and defense increase. And then the final one, of course, when battling on terrain with defense up, flyer's damage taken is reduced by a certain percentage. This one is the least likely to kick in because it's kind of hard for Dieharte, who is cavalry unit, to get onto terrain that increases defense. But nonetheless, with the other two, that's a 40% attack and defense increase right there, right? Before you even factor in the Griffin Knight's personal boost. By comparison though, the cavalry soldiers, their skills are kind of odd. The first one, of course, is the usual anti-infantry special, doing more damage to infantry. But the other two is that one requires an ally to be within 2 blocks for cavalry attack and defense to increase, right? Given that cavalry are the ones that, you know, launch the first strikes very frequently, this effect usually will not kick in, you know? So it's almost a wasted skill. And then the other skill is when attacking, your damage taken is decreased by a certain percentage. You know? So in many ways, cavalry units don't get a huge attacking defense increase advantage, despite what it may seem. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of the cavalry soldiers in general. You know, granted, mind you, Heaven's Guard, with assuming your Heaven's Guard are level 10, they get a plus 45% attack increase right here, right? So that can kind of balance out against the 40% attacking increase that flyers have, but not really, in my opinion, because they're still lacking defense increase, which means, again, they're glass cannons. So, just something for your consideration. Overall, I would say if you're using Royal Knight Dietharte, best soldier would be Griffin Knights. Those would be the go-to soldier for him. Alright, so with the soldiers covered, let's talk about Dieharte's equipment. And in terms of equipment, it's quite simple. Okay, you would use Seal Guardian, because Seal Guardian is the best sword with the highest attack increase. For armor, I would recommend the... Actually, let me just bring it up in the summon screen. For him, I would actually recommend, in terms of armor, I don't have it, but the Aeolus' battle armor. The reason I recommend Aeolus' battle armor is because first it increases hit points and defense by 5%, and the other effect is when under range attack, it has a 30% chance to lower damage taken by your unit by 30%. Since Dieharte is very vulnerable to magic attacks and so on, Aeolus' battle armor, if it kicks in, can keep your Dieharte alive. So that's why this would be his best armor. He's already very strong against melee attacks, so he does not need, let's say, the Bloodline Magic armor, right? So this is the armor that has the highest possibility of letting him survive when he takes attacks, which makes it the best one for him. So, other than the armor, for his helmet, it would be what I said earlier, which is the Golden Lion. If you don't have the Golden Lion, you can temporarily use either of the following. Let me just go into Dieharte first. The first helmet that would be decent for him, although not necessarily great, is Vampire Mask. Because Vampire Mask, right, if there's an enemy within 2 blocks, you can decrease their defense by 20%. Okay, so that would be the first armor, which is a solid choice. And the reason why I say it's not necessarily great is because unlike Leon, right, in order for him to move after he attacks, he needs mobility, right? So it's hard for him to activate the Vampire Mask, because if you move up within 2 tiles of the enemy, activate Sprint, right? Then you move in to attack, you only have 2 movement left to retreat. So that's something to be aware of. Whereas, Leon is guaranteed to have 3 movement to retreat after he attacks. The other helmet you can use on Dieharte would be Reaper's Breath, because Reaper's Breath, right, kicks in if you kill an enemy. So, given that Dieharte is supposed to be your enemy he's supposed to kill off enemies, Reaper's Breath can certainly work. In fact, I would certainly recommend Reaper's Breath for his PvP builds. So basically 2 options for until the Golden Line is released. Both are solid choices. And the final item for Dieharte in terms of accessory is, I would say, either Overlord's Badge because of the attack and int reduction immunity, or and if not Overlord's Badge, then Slayer's Emblem, because Slayer's Emblem increases attack against flyers by 20%, and that's just huge. So those would be his best accessories: Slayer's Emblem or Overlord's Badge. So that is the build for a Cavalry Dieharte. And and in terms of his skills, this is what I would recommend. You would bring, this is a PvP option. You would probably bring Strike. Second skill would be 1,000 Hooves, and then the third skill would be Move Again. This way you can, move forward, use Strike, hit the enemy with 1,000 Hooves, and then have Move Again kick in so that you can retreat back a bit. That would be his ideal PvP build. In terms of PvE content, if he's single character class like mine is right now, this would probably be his best build. Move Again, Strike, and then Onrush. Onrush because it increases defense and magic defense before the battle begins, right? And it has a low cooldown. So rather than 1,000 Hooves, you would bring Onrush. But if you have the double class mastery, I would probably take it a step further and choose to remove either Strike or Onrush, most likely Strike, in favor of bringing the faction buff. Because in that sense, Dieharte, as I was saying, Dieharte is one of the better faction buffers for the Origins of Light team. And if you're playing Origins of Light, you definitely want Dieharte as a faction buffer. So that would be the other build, bringing the faction buff instead of Strike. Alright, so let's talk about how you would build an Assassin Dieharte now. And an Assassin Dieharte is utterly equipment dependent. In order to build him, you need this equipment before you even consider building him as an assassin. The most important piece of gear is the Extreme Magic Bow, which I still don't have a copy of, because the Extreme Magic Bow eliminates melee penalties, right? Dieharte is going to move in, kill off a target, and then have Smoke activate, right? So that he takes reduced damage if he gets attacked. In order for him to do high damage to any enemy that attacks him, you're going to need this Extreme Magic Bow, where unit damage is not reduced in melee battles. Otherwise, if he gets attacked by let's say a cavalry unit in the melee, he's not going to do any damage to them. So without Extreme Magic Bow, you should not bother to build an Assassin Dieharte. Now, other than the Extreme Magic Bow though, you should bring, for armor, the Monkey King's Vest. And I actually have a copy of that one. Monkey King's Vest, I think it's unarmed, yep. Because the way this thing works is, when attack and crit is increased by, it goes up to 15%. Mine is level 40, so it's only 12%. So, nothing needs to be said, right? More attack, more crit hit rate, you're more likely to kill anything that attacks you. In terms of helmet, once again, it should be the Golden Lion. Again, if you don't have it, you can use Death Breath or Vampire's Mask. Death Breath? Reaper's Breath? Yeah. And then, once again, for the accessory, I personally suggest Overlord's Badge. If you don't have Overlord's Badge, Slayer's Emblem is fine too on Dieharte. So in terms of helmets and in terms of the accessory, that doesn't change. Actually, just a quick note. I don't think Assassin Dieharte can use Vampire Mask or Reaper's Breath because he's no longer a cavalry class. So in terms of helmet for his assassin class, I maybe I'm actually not sure, I have to say. Maybe, probably, Loki's mask. Because when you attack, your defense is increased, so you have a higher chance of surviving, and it increases hit points by a bit. So that could be a decent option. Basically, I guess whatever helmet you can use, or whatever helmet you have at level 50, until, you know, you get the unique helm for Dieharte, Golden Lion. Alright, so that would be his gear. In terms of skill set that he would bring, quite similar. For PvP purposes, definitely bring Strike. That would be, as I said, the core skill. Your second skill would definitely be Calamity, because you're going to need the Ignore Guard skill. That's the whole point of bringing an assassin, right? So with Strike, you're increasing your ability to 6 tiles, and then he has a 2-tile attack range, right? So basically, Dieharte has an 8 range attack radius for PvP. And then the very third skill, the last one, it's kind of your choice. You can bring Move Again for the attack and retreat ability, as well as doing 10% more damage when attacking. If you don't want to bring Move Again, you can always bring Sneak Attack. Because Sneak Attack would deal a critical damage to the battle, or sorry, when dealing critical damage in battle, you deal an extra fixed damage once after the battle. So on the off chance your Dieharte doesn't hit hard enough to kill off the enemy, Sneak Attack can kick in and get you the kill, and then activate his talent. And in terms of soldiers, you want Shinobi for the very same reason. First, Shinobi increases the crit rate is increased by 10%, and then just like Sneak Attack, critical hits deal extra damage after battle, and it's 7% of the enemy unit's max hit points. So that 7% is, I think, because my Shinobis themselves are quite low level. In fact, they're not even unlocked yet, right? So when it's unlocked, this percentage would steadily increase. So that's why Shinobi would be his best soldiers in his assassin class. 2 range and the ability to make sure, guarantee that you get the kill. Alrighty. So that is everything about how to build Dieharte. You know, I covered all his equipment, all his best soldiers, and you know what skills to get if he has single or double class mastery. Oh, I actually forgot to mention how you would build a PvE version of the Assassin Dieharte. Well, pretty easy. You would keep pretty much the same skill set, right? Strike, Calamity, Move Again, or Sneak Attack. And then you can always choose to replace one of them with his faction buff, assuming you're playing Origins of Light. If you're not playing Origins of Light, if you're playing, you know, Protagonist or Meteor, well, Protagonist has Matthew to faction buff, and then Meteor has Zerida to faction buff. Right? So in both of those cases, Dieharte would not be your faction buffer, so you don't need to bring it. Alright, so thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you found this information useful about how to build your Dieharte successfully and use him. Just as a quick summary though, I would say if you're not committing runestones into him, put him into the Cavalry class, because as I said, he makes a great Cavalry unit, and there's a very limited number of Cavalry units available to both Protagonist and Origins of Light, and even Meteor. Alright, that's everything I wanted to say. On that note, Nitro out.